So welcome everyone to the fifth, I forget which one, fourth of whatever number of talks we'll be having in our resilience seminar series with the School of Cities. Thanks for joining us. Today I'm very happy to introduce Erin Biehl, who's joining us from Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. Erin is a program officer focusing on food system sustainability and public health, and has taken on this role after completing her BA in public policy from the University of Michigan and a master's in public health from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. In her role as the program officer, she coordinates research, policy, and outreach activities related to the program's three focus areas of reducing wasted food, supporting urban food system resilience, and connecting diet and climate change, which I think fit very closely with the objectives of this seminar series that we put together on resilience in food and health supply chains. So I'm looking forward to hearing her talk. And we can't really welcome her. We could clap, I guess. I mean, we can welcome her. It's just, I don't know how to do it in this format. So please welcome her in whatever way you can, and I'll turn it over to her. If you want to just go ahead and share your screen, Erin, we'll let you take the reins.
Thank you for that warm welcome. I feel very welcomed. I'm going to be talking today about some work we've been doing with 5 cities here in the US to build their capacity to do more food system resilience planning within their cities. Does that look any better?
Perfect.
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, sorry for that delay. I can't believe I closed my own presentation. So yes, I'll be talking about our work with 5 cities in the US on food system resilience planning. And if you aren't familiar with the Center for a Livable Future, we are an academic center in the School of Public Health here at Hopkins, and we focus on research, communications, advocacy, and education, all related to food systems, public health, and the environment, and where they all intersect. So one of the things that I work on at the center is urban food system resilience. And so today I'll kind of do a quick overview of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about urban food system resilience. I'll describe some of the history of the work that we've been done around resilience planning, and then I'll talk more about this community of practice with 5 cities and some of the outcomes we've seen working with them so far. And then I'll just talk about some of our next steps, and we can do some Q&A at the end. So urban food system resilience. I don't know why it keeps going forward. Just so we're all on the same, oh my God. Okay, just so we're all on the same page. So when I'm talking about a food system, I'm talking about all of the activities and resources that go into producing, distributing, and consuming food, the drivers and outcomes of those processes, and all of the relationships and feedback loops between system components. And so I know some of this seminar series is focused on food supply chains. So I'll be talking a little bit about food supply chains, but also the food system more broadly today. And when I'm talking about resilience, I'm talking about the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to adverse events. And I just like to point out the way that we think about resilience is not only recovering from an event and returning to the state that a system was in before the event, but if needed, the ability to transform and improve the system after some sort of crisis occurs, recognizing that, like in our food system, there are a lot of things that are wrong to begin with, and we don't necessarily want to be going right back to that. We want to be improving. All right, thank you so much. I'm so sorry. Okay, so resilience. As we've all seen, COVID-19 has threatened our food system and food security in the US in many different ways. But it's not the only threat to food systems that we're concerned about. And even while we have a pandemic going on, we're also concerned about rising threat from climate change and severe disasters and other different types of disruptions. And so even in addition to natural disasters, we're also thinking about some essentially human-made crises, such as civil unrest. So in 2015 in the city of Baltimore, there was some civil unrest in the city. And actually we were able to map out that there were a number of food retailers who were looted or damaged in some way during that unrest. And they were actually in areas where there was kind of limited food access to begin with. And so this event was something that happened that really, among other things, spurred the city's efforts to start including food in their crisis planning and also including non-disaster events in their food resilience planning. So we need a resilient food system, and that means that we need a food system that has the capacity over time to provide sufficient, appropriate, and accessible food to all in the face of various and even unforeseen disturbances. And a number of things can contribute to a resilient food system. It needs to be robust and flexible in the face of different challenges. There need to be redundant supply chains, for example. So if one route of transporting food is blocked or shut down, there's still another way of getting food into a city. This also includes adaptability and resourcefulness. And so the ability of actors within the system to learn from experiences, adjust what they're doing, and kind of find a new norm. And I think we're seeing a lot of these things coming through in our society in general during the pandemic. And then some other concepts that we look at thinking about food system resilience are, is there a low risk and low exposure in the system? And what kind of vulnerabilities are there in terms of vulnerable populations, vulnerable aspects of the food system infrastructure, and what kind of exposure to different hazards, like are our food supply or are our food sources located within major floodplains, for example. So this is kind of our take on this food system resilience curve that incorporates several different concepts. So the way we're thinking about how to understand food system resilience after a disaster is looking at what is the level of food system functioning at any given point in time. So if you look at the horizontal and curved line as the level of food system functioning, you can do what you can to prepare for an event and to minimize your exposure and risk of, experiencing challenges because of the event. And then afterwards, to improve the ability of the food system to continue functioning, you need to be able to absorb and adapt. And as I mentioned earlier, transform the system to a new normal. So the way that we think about food system functioning across time is based on the UN Food and Agriculture Organization definition of food security, which incorporates food access, availability, and utilization, and stability across time. So we kind of changed this a little bit and said that a food system that is functioning well is able to ensure accessible, available, and acceptable food to the population at all times. And for our work, we've been thinking about the population in question as an urban population. So are urban residents able to do they have access to food? Is the food that is available and accessible, is it culturally appropriate? Is it safe? Is it nutritious? So all of these things need to be in place for the food system to be considered functioning, at least at a minimal level. And so this is really difficult to see. I know it's a lot of images and tiny text, but this is kind of describing project that we did with some civil engineers at Johns Hopkins to develop a framework for trying to understand and map out where there might be vulnerabilities in a food system and in the supply chain, using something called fault tree analysis. So the idea is that at the top you have, a food system failure, which we describe as basically an food insecure population. And then what are all of the events that can lead up to that failure happening? And so there are different stages. And so we kind of thought through the food system in terms of, what could happen that could cut off access to food in a city, what could happen to, cut off the supply of food into the city, and then what would make it, the wrong type of food or not safe, for example. And then you just kind of think all the way down to like, what are the basic events that are happening that are causing these problems? And so that kind of has helped us work with some cities in thinking about like, where are the kind of the weak links in their supply chains and in their systems. All right, so that's a quick overview of the concepts, I guess. So now moving into the work that we've done to help cities actually include these ideas in their planning. So probably around 5 years ago now, we had started looking into what kind of resources are out there that can help cities and city planners incorporate food into their disaster preparedness planning, into their climate adaptation planning, anything kind of related to building more resilient cities, essentially. And at the time, this was in 2015, 2016, there weren't that many resources out there. You'll kind of see in the images here, there were a handful of reports from different cities. We looked in North America in particular, that did kind of mention food system resilience in their planning, but it was still very much kind of not a huge focus. And then over the years, we've seen more and more cities that are interested in this idea of food system resilience planning. And one of those cities was Baltimore. So I'm located in Baltimore, and so our center has a good relationship with the Office of Sustainability there. And so they asked us to help them work towards some sort of food system resilience plan for Baltimore City. And that resulted in the Food System Resilience Advisory Report, which was then incorporated into their update of their sustainability plan not too long ago. And we were able to do this because Baltimore has been looking at the food environment for a number of years, and we worked with them to come up with this definition of food deserts, although the name has changed now, and kind of the groundwork of collecting data and trying to understand where there were food access challenges in the city really helped us then apply that same data and frame to think about what does this look like in a disaster situation, and where are the communities who are most likely to be most impacted by a disruption in the food supply. So we've been working on that, and we did all this work with Baltimore because in their disaster preparedness plan, they had recommended to develop a food security plan for the city. And it was about 1 page that they talked about food, but nothing more. And so we were really trying to bring the full complexity of the food system to their resilience planning and disaster preparedness planning. And we came up with a number of recommendations for what Baltimore could do. Again, kind of focused on those different components of the food system fault tree. So looking at ways to improve economic and physical access, improve the ability through supporting supply chains, and also building social capital at the community level was another important aspect of what we kind of came up with in Baltimore. So that is where we began really working on food system resilience. We finished that report in 2017, so it's been a few years. And because of what we did in Baltimore, we had been connected with a handful of other cities who were interested in doing this similar type of planning work. And we finally got funding to do this about a year ago through the National Science Foundation. And so we at the Center for a Livable Future have been working with the PI of this project, who's at American University, as well as the Hopkins Center for Applied Public Research, to form a food system resilience community of practice. And the goals of that, or the objectives of the community of practice, are to foster collaborative learning between a network of diverse cities working on food systems resilience, to develop and test tools that enable stakeholders to understand and plan for resilience in their food system, and then to monitor the process of the community of practice and evaluate the impacts for participants so that we can build on what we develop with them and share it with other cities to ultimately build this toolkit of resources available for cities who want to do more food resilience planning. And so there's also a research component of this because we wanted to, it's a practice project, but also a research project. So we want to understand what are the barriers to effective food system resilience planning in local governments. We want to know if participation in this community of practice and the shared learning and co-creation of resources, if that experience can help governments overcome some of these food resilience planning barriers, and if it can actually improve the preparedness of the people we're actually working with and their ability to be resilient in these crisis situations after going through all of this. And then we want to know how applicable are the tools we develop to other cities, and can we actually share them? So to put together this community of practice, we recruited 2 to 3 participants from each of 5 cities around the US. We really tried to bring in people who were either working within their local government or were somehow providing consulting or services to the local government that were related to food policy. So for example, one of our participants is actually part of a local food policy council that advises the government on various food issues. And we tried to find people whose job roles related to food systems or climate change adaptation or resilience in some way. And we wanted to get people who knew more about disasters and more people who knew more about food, so we could kind of bring them together and talk about food system resilience more holistically. And then we asked them to commit to participating in a series of 6 calls over the last 6 months about different resilience topics. And also they had to complete some preparation materials before each call. And we recruited these different cities through existing networks that we had with food planners, and also through our Food Policy Networks project. And we really try to get a diverse mix of cities based on geography, their risk of different natural hazards, the level of food system planning they already had, their population, how prevalent food insecurity was in their city, and also what their political structure in their government looked like. Was it a city kind of dominated by the mayor or dominated by a city council? Different structures. So the 5 cities that we ended up with are Baltimore City, Orlando, Florida, Austin, Texas, Denver, Colorado, and Moorhead, Minnesota. And I'm going to just quickly go through a little bit about these cities so you have an idea of some context here. All of them, most of them are mid-sized cities. So Austin, Texas is around 960,000 people. Before COVID, the food insecurity rate was 18.2%. I'm not sure what it is now. And the hazards that they're most concerned about are heat, flooding, wildfires, but also the fact that they have seen enormous economic growth in the city in the past several years, but it's not growth that is occurring equally for everyone in the city. And so there's a lot of inequality that's causing a lot of other issues, or is basically, yeah. So there are a lot of things that they're concerned about, and the people we worked with were from the Office of Sustainability, and they're really taking a regional approach and looking at not just what is happening in the Austin's, food system in the city boundaries, but what's happening in the surrounding counties and the metro area in general. Baltimore, a little bit smaller than Austin, but there's a pretty high food insecurity rate of 23%, and 1 in 4 people live in neighborhoods that are designated as food deserts. And in Baltimore, we're pretty concerned about flooding and blizzards in the wintertime. And then, like I mentioned, in 2015, the civil unrest really raised a lot of awareness as well over the need to build resilient systems. And Baltimore City has a very strong food policy initiative and a food policy director who is paid to work on food policy. So they've been able to do a lot of work on food in general, but also on food resilience. So Denver, their food security, 11.9%. Similar to Austin, their hazards are related to heat and wildfires. They also mentioned, though, because they're right next to the Rocky Mountains, there are some issues related to, getting over the mountains. And if there's certain weather in the mountains that impacts roads, essentially, how does that impact what's going into the city from that direction? And we're working with their Department of Public Health and Environment and the Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency. And then the last 2 cities are a little bit smaller. So Moorhead, Minnesota has only 42,000 people, and they're actually located on the western edge of the state of Minnesota. They're right on the border with North Dakota, across from Fargo. So Fargo is a larger city, but the Fargo-Moorhead area is kind of a metro area in its own, although in different states. So that presents unique challenges for their food policy. The food insecurity rate was much lower than the other cities, and they mentioned that they're concerned about flooding in the Midwest, and then again this issue of living on a state border. The policies are different in different states, and so it's difficult to navigate sometimes when you're trying to change food system policy and the system crosses different borders. And then we're working with someone from the University of Minnesota Extension, actually, and also someone who is on their city council. So it's a little bit different than the other cities. And then finally, Orlando. So Orlando is where Disney World is located. So a lot of the workforce in that city is somehow connected with Disney and tourism in general. So actually, the economic displacement from COVID-19 has caused a lot of challenges in terms of people being unemployed and not being able to afford food. So that's a pretty specific thing that they were concerned about. Also, being in Florida, they have to worry about hurricanes and sea level rise. And it's a city that is quickly urbanizing and kind of taking over farmland as it expands. So they're concerned about the loss of farmland as well as farmers in their region. So those are the 5 cities that we are working with and have been working with for about 6 months. And so what we have been doing with them in the past 6 months is basically work together to develop resources that can be useful for them for understanding food system resilience and knowing where to build it into their planning processes. And then the ultimate goal of this is to take those resources that we've co-created and come up with a toolkit that other cities can use as well. So we had a series of 6 calls, 1.25 or 1.5 hours long. They were pretty short, but we covered a series of different topics. We covered just food system resilience concepts in general. We had them do stakeholder assessment to understand who in their city and region they should be working with in the context of a crisis. Um, we had them do a scoping and baseline assessment to understand what is the state of their food system right now. What are the assets and what are the challenges and gaps in their system that need to be addressed. And we had them think about what are the key hazards affecting their city's food system and what are the key vulnerabilities. And then we talked about what are some strategies for building resilience and what are goals that you could set, and then what does it look like to develop and implement a food system resilience plan. So I'm going to share just some kind of high-level takeaways from our conversations with the cities. We started the community of practice right around the same time as the pandemic hit the US and everything shut down. So we actually spent some time at the beginning just giving them space to share with one another what they were experiencing with food access in their cities. And so an interesting thing that we heard was, even though the pandemic really brought to light a lot of challenges in our food system, they felt like they were still having to make the case for why it's important to think about food system resilience, and even why do we need to think about food when we're thinking about disasters. So there's still like a case that needs to be made. Several of the cities said that the role they've been playing during the pandemic was coordinating emergency food responder calls. So the city as coordinator. They talked a lot about relationships and having good, strong relationships with people across city government and in the community. That really helped them kind of quickly respond to challenges with the pandemic. I don't know if any of them had included food in pandemic or emergency response plans, or if they had a food resilience plan, they didn't really think about what would happen in a pandemic. So there were a lot of challenges there. And then they mentioned the difficulty of matching, where is the need in their city and where are the sources of food assistance, and how can we better track that information to better serve the population. So after we talked about COVID, then we dived into a stakeholder assessment. And so we asked them to pick any sort of challenge or crisis, like it could be the COVID-19 pandemic, and to think of who are all the stakeholders they would need to work with to overcome this challenge. And we asked them to make a list of the stakeholders, and then they came back together and we talked about what that experience was like and who was on their list that they maybe hadn't thought of before. And what came out of that was, again, relationships are really important in being able to respond in the short term to events. And that trust is also important, but those things can't be written into a plan. So the planning process should enable and encourage relationship and trust building, but you can't just, enact something that establishes a relationship, for example. And then one of the interesting things was from the city perspective, even if there's a huge list of people who are really critical for the food system, it's important to think about who needs to be at the table in a crisis and when. And there's kind of like different tiers of people depending on their role who they may need to work with at different times. So when we did a scoping and baseline assessment with them, one of the things that we talked about was, how do you define the boundaries of your city's food system, and what kind of food system do you actually want to make resilient? Recognizing that our food system is global, and so there are many different levels. But we encourage them to think about, from the perspective of a city planner and somebody working in or with a local government, what is the what are the boundaries of where you actually have influence? Is it really just within city boundaries? Is that where you really should focus because that's where you can have the most impact? Or, are you able to make partnerships and relationships with people in surrounding jurisdictions who maybe have more control over where your food is being produced, for example? And that was a really, really challenging question for them. And I don't know that we came up with a good answer of how do you define the boundaries of your city's food system. I'd be interested to know what you all think. But it was a really, I think, important aspect of this. We also had them kind of look at what existing plans and goals related to food system they had in their city and talk about, when you're thinking about food resilience, what are some of the end goals that might already be goals you're working towards, but they're just framed through resilience rather than healthy food, for example. We asked them to think about what are your food system's assets, from physical and natural assets in the food system in the city to intellectual assets like local universities that they can partner with to do research. And then again, what kinds of challenges are they already facing? Like if they have high food insecurity, even before a crisis, that's something that they need to address regardless. But if they address that, then that can improve resilience in the long run as well. We also looked at what are the different hazards and vulnerabilities in each of these cities. I kind of talked about the key hazards earlier on when I talked about the cities. I think just the main takeaway is that right now it's COVID is number one on everyone's mind, but now it's COVID plus flooding or COVID plus hurricane season. So, we have this longer term crisis happening, and these cities are now also having to deal with, the other hazards they would be dealing with otherwise. So there's multiple layers that they're dealing with. Some of the common vulnerabilities in their local systems that were discussed were just historically inequitable policies that have led to inequitable food access or unequal food access in their cities, dwindling farmer populations and farmland, like I mentioned in the case of Orlando, having a workforce heavily concentrated in one sector. So from the perspective of having a food secure population, not having a diverse workforce, kind of making it more likely that, if that sector has high layoffs, for example, people might be more food insecure. There's kind of a lack of consistent funding for staff in governments who are working on food specifically. Lack of coordination between food assistance organizations working on the ground. And particularly for COVID, early on, there weren't really backups to congregate feeding models. So this is something that was, they had to deal with as a new thing, I guess. And so we're still working with them on the, what do you actually do once you have all of this information? But when we've talked about actual strategies for figuring out how to build resilience, knowing all these limitations, community engagement was very critical to the process. We haven't been engaging with communities while we're working with cities. And so none of this is actually leading to a plan at the end, but we've kind of discussed how it's kind of giving them the tools they need to be able to talk about food system resilience and why it's important to address in their city and how it can be addressed, but then actually talking with communities about what is happening on the ground and what is your experience with, this hazard or the pandemic, and, what really needs to be happening in your community. Again, focus on building strong relationships. That's just across the board really important. And then a specific thing that was discussed was the need to update emergency operations plans in cities to formally include people working on food systems. So in Baltimore, for example, they added a food person to their emergency operations, like chain of command, or forgot the right word, but basically there's a food person who sits in the room when they have an emergency and everybody gets together to figure out what to do. And so that hadn't happened before. And so now there's somebody who's like, wait a minute, what about the food? What about food access? And so we're still working on the rest of that. And I'm almost done, but I just wanted to say part of this project also has been trying to identify more quantitative indicators of food system functioning, so that we can figure out how can we track how well the food system's working before and after this disaster, and can we really see, is it being more resilient, and at what point is it recovering, for example. So we've been collecting a lot of data during COVID-19 on food access, affordability, food supply chains, and COVID data, like COVID cases. And we're going to be looking at that and working with these cities as well on, if you were to use county level and state level data on your food system, and it's available every single month during the pandemic, how can that be used to further your work on supporting your food system at a local level? So big picture lessons we've learned so far were relationships are key, but we collaborate at the speed of trust. That's actually what somebody said. Again, community collaborations, guidance and input are vital. Language matters. We had a lot of discussions when talking about vulnerability about, there's one way of talking about vulnerability if you're thinking about infrastructure, but then how do you talk about it if you're, thinking about your communities? And that maybe the language we use to identify vulnerable infrastructure doesn't always fit with communities. And likewise, definitions differ between sectors. So we're working with people who focus on food. And so the way they think about things might be different than the way that disaster planners or emergency operations center thinks about things. And so communicating between those sectors and making sure everyone has the same understanding of these concepts is important. Scoping is difficult, as I said. It's hard to identify what exactly are your food system boundaries for this work. We talked about goals needing to be quantifiable, measurable, and obtainable. And this work is essential. Even though we're in the middle of a pandemic and the city representatives we've been working with are under a lot of pressure and are very busy, they've showed up to these monthly calls and said over and over again, thank you for making us think about the long term, because it is important to think about longer term, the resilience of our food system. And if they didn't have somebody making them show up once a month to think about that, they would get lost in the immediate, emergency that's happening right now. And the process is iterative and non-linear. So we had a pretty linear process of going through all of these concepts, but we've learned a lot along the way from these cities. And so we're just constantly kind of revising how we're thinking about food system resilience and what we can actually share with other cities in meaningful ways. So next, we've finished our meetings, our kind of 6 months of meetings with the cities. We will be surveying them after the COP to understand how this affected their understanding of food system resilience, and as well as how they perceive the importance of the issue and their self-efficacy, and some other indicators. We will be interviewing them also to get a better understanding of their experience in the process. And then based on what they've taught us, we're going to be doing a social network analysis study of the 5 cities and the stakeholders that they're working with to understand how their social networks have changed or been helpful during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're also going to be taking everything we've learned and coming out with an actual suite of resources that we will then take back to these cities, but then also work with them to share with other cities and improve it. So that's the project. And thank you so much for being patient with all of my technical difficulties. I really appreciate the chance to speak about this today. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Excuse me. Thank you, Erin. You might see some virtual applause through this gallery view here. So we've got time for some questions, and I guess Laura, you jumped the gun here, so I'm gonna I'll read your question, I guess, or you can ask it yourself, perhaps.
Sure, I'll come off and ask it. That was a great talk, Erin, and really look forward to all the resources that are going to be generated from this project. So my question is, just on that last bit, you were mentioning how a food expert would be represented in the incident response table or command table, or whoever's responding to the emergency. And did they talk more, did you to unpack more sort of how do you make sure it's not just another voice? Because I think one of the challenges that in these tables, you just hear from lots of different interests versus having a more integrated response that really considers food throughout. And I just wondered if that came up at all.
That's a great question. So having a food person at the table was just one of the things that they did. So in Baltimore, they actually came up with a whole emergency food access plan. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but really focused on the very short-term response, and came up with ways to specifically better coordinate feeding sites for kids and for seniors and like the overall population. And so they came up with actual procedural recommendations, I think, that they were then trying to get the Mayor's Office of Emergency Management to adopt. So, and one of those things was having a food person sitting there, but there are other things that they're working on to actually integrate food into everything. And one thing I will say that they often say this is, in thinking about how to get food incorporated into everything, they kind of took the perspective of how do we just add food in there without actually adding something new. So if we're talking to the Department of Transportation, and they're already going out and clearing roads or doing deliveries for something, you know, how can we just say, hey, could you add this food component? You know, you're already doing this work. So, you know, making food kind of everywhere it needs to be without getting people to think that they're doing a ton of extra work for it. I think that's part of what you might be getting at.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Oh, I think somebody's asking a question, but they're muted. Maggie?
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry. I was just saying, my name is Maggie. I'm a grade 12 student, and I'm doing a project on sort of the role of urban agriculture and helping solve some social inequalities. And I was wondering how you've seen urban agriculture help in these food systems in like the cities you've studied.
Yeah, so I think urban agriculture, so far from what I've seen, is often like one of the first things that cities think about when they're thinking about building food system resilience. So they'll say, oh, well, we need to support more urban agriculture because we need to be able to produce food within our city. And I know, and like, so in Orlando, for example, they're working on a food system ordinance, and they're actually working to expand their community gardens in food deserts, for example, as one part of their strategy. I do like to then add onto that and say, urban agriculture is kind of one step of it, but how are you going to support the resilience of the food supply chain that's coming into the city from elsewhere, if you can't actually support the entire urban population through production in the city? So kind of thinking about urban production, but then also supporting resilient supply chains from elsewhere. They're both important, I'd say.
Yeah, that's a good question and a good, I think, response. I mean, there's also a lot of labor that goes into urban agriculture, so it's quite complicated to sort of rely on it, but it is an important component in some ways. Thank you, Maggie. Did you have a follow-up?
No, thanks so much. That's great.
Okay. Any other questions? We have probably time for one or two more.
Hi, my name is Eleonora. I'm a master's student at York University. I just had a question. I'm actually doing my thesis on emergency food planning in the wake of COVID-19. And COVID-19 has really exposed the gaps that are in urban and regional planning. And my question is, how as planners do you think we could improve on emergency food preparedness with the limited movement we're seeing in the planning regime? So we're not seeing many changes happening. And I guess, like, I just want to, what would you say, what would we need to change in order to see more food and more preparedness pertaining to food coming into planning as a function?
That's the question. Why isn't it in there more? So one of the things that we've talked about with these cities, and we actually did a workshop focused on communication and how do you make the case for this work. And kind of thinking about, for example, how do you make talking about food systems like an economic issue and speak to economic development, for example? Like, how do you talk about these issues in ways that are appealing to people in other sectors or other departments of a city, outside of, you know, the people who already know why it's important and they're working in food? That's not a very specific example, but I think part of it is how can we communicate the urgency and the need for this work in ways that really get at decision makers' core, I guess, and really works for them and what they're trying to achieve.
Sorry for like the intricate question. I'm really grappling that with myself too right now.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right. I'm going to take just the last question quickly. I was curious, I was wondering if you had many or any feedback or participants who were in, say, food retail or distribution or productions. I'm curious to see if the insights, if you had any insights from sort of the sort of for-profit world into what it meant for them versus, say, maybe advocates or planners or government workers.
Yeah, so the community of practice is people within government, although we've talked with them about, do you involve for-profit or do you focus on nonprofit food assistance? When we did the Baltimore report, we did a series of interviews with people across the food system serving Baltimore. So we did actually interview food retailers, and we talked with somebody at a major food distribution hub. So in that work, when we actually went and did the research to do the full planning, we did talk with the for-profit sector, and they were just as much a focus of our research and the recommendations as the nonprofit sector. Okay. And there's a lot to learn, I think, from the for-profit sector as well.
Yeah, well, they play such a huge role, right? Like, yeah. It's hard to do a food system resilience plan without thinking about them. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Well, maybe we'll leave it there, and thank you very much for your time, Erin. It was an excellent talk, and we appreciate you distracting yourself from U.S. politics for a few hours. So good. Now you can go doom scroll.
Yeah.
For the rest of the evening.
Oh,
But,
thank you so much for having me.
Of course, and thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you next week. All right, take care, everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.